welcome to the MessianTics Podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
Shalom. We have an interesting program, or at least one we hope will be interesting for everyone this week. We're going to be talking about Tu Bishevat, and we're going to be talking about Purim, but we're going to be talking about them from a what I think is a unique and different perspective. First of all, for those that may be new, Tu Bishevat is the new year for trees. It happens usually between February and March on the Greco-Roman calendar, and it is the time when tithing on trees was done. In Judaism, contrary to popular belief, there isn't just one or two New Years. There's actually 5. We have New Year's Rosh Hashanah, which is the new year of creation of mankind. We have Nisan 1, which is the new year that's established with the Exodus. We have Tu Bishevat, which is the new year for tithing on trees. We have the tithing on animals, which happens in July or August. And then we have Yom Kippur, which is the new year for the Shemitah and the Yovel, the counting of the year of Shemitah and the 50th year or the Jubilee year. So this month in February, we'll be celebrating Tu Bishevat. Tu Bishevat is a time where, as I said, we mark the tithing on trees. And traditionally, Tu Bishevat is celebrated by having like a Passover Seder, a Seder. It's has been put together. It celebrates the Shiva Hamayin, which are wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates, all the fruits that are spoken of in as part of the land of milk and honey. So that's celebrated during February. And then somewhere either in February or March is Purim, or the Feast of Esther, the Feast of Lots. And that's really where we want to focus most of our attention today on from a unique perspective, because for Tu Bishevat, you have a family dinner where you eat the fruits of these trees and are thankful for them and bless God for His provision. On Purim is a celebration of the victory of the Jews over the Persians in the time of Esther and the whole story of Esther and all that goes on in the book of Esther. But it's traditional to do what's called a Purim spiel as part of a Purim celebration. Some congregations will have carnivals, different things for the children. They'll dress up in costumes. Some will do biblical costumes. Other congregations get into almost a Halloweenish type costume event. But many congregations not only read the book of Esther, but they do what's known as a Purim play or a Purim spiel. And some of those Purim spiels are worthy of recognition, not for being good, but for being absolutely atrocious.
It's almost like they have to be bad.
Right. It's kind of like when you watch one of those things that you just know is going. It's like the Mystery Science Theater 2000, where you have the robots mocking the old B-rated spoof science fiction movies and stuff.
I've only seen part of that.
Yeah.
Now, we have had several really good Purim plays, but many of them, even though they're intended to be good and well done, they're dependent upon the acting ability and the process of children and volunteer thespians. And so it's just interesting. So we're going to share some of our experiences with Purim and Purim spiels on our podcast today. So who wants to jump in?
Well, I was going to say, before we get too far ahead, it's also traditional to plant trees, right? On Tu
Bishevat, we'll plant trees. We have a little orchard we're planting here at Berdam, and so we're going to plant a peach tree this year. Last 2 years we planted orange trees. We're planting a peach tree this year.
Yeah. And the orange trees just barely did survive the cold Siberian front that came down from the north winds.
Right.
And
So our olive trees are there. We also have a fig tree that we planted. So we plant a tree each year.
The fig tree?
The fig tree is blossoming.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
I haven't looked at him in a while.
It's like a biblical proportion thing.
Yeah.
So anyhow, on Tu Bishevat, you plant trees. Many people plant trees in Israel, and if you want to plant trees in Israel, there's several ways you can do it. I know that Congregation Beth Adonai on their website, bethadonai.com, has a link that you can have a tree planted in Israel. Also, the MJAA at mjaa.org has a link that you can plant trees in Israel. And which is, again, a traditional way of observing and celebrating Tu Bishevat. But so let's go back to Purim. Purim, again, just like in churches, they have bad children's productions that all the parents rave about how wonderful their children were.
That's my baby.
That's my baby. So they Purim spiels are that way. So who wants to jump in with your tale of Purim?
Is this about the spiels, or we're sharing?
The spiels.
And I would say, let's make it can be about bad spiels, of course, but also like Reverend was saying, like, you know, there are some things that even if it wasn't bad, it was still just funny.
Yeah. So again, just to provide some context, and Rabbi Eric covered that, but it's just what we're celebrating in Purim, which is always around spring, is we're celebrating essentially what happened in the Book of Esther, which is God saved the people of Israel from an oppressive nation, and so essentially what we're doing is we're acting out what happened. It's like the equivalent of, again, I was raised in the church, so I grew up with the Christmas, the nativity scenes, and those were always funny. Looking back, I mean, as a kid, you're like, wow, we're really a part of something cool, or whatever. And I have played some roles, in the church. I was Moses one time, and my bedsheet fell off on stage.
So I'm just curious to ask.
I was wearing
Were you wearing the bedsheet Scottish style?
I had on a Dick Tracy shirt. Remember Dick Tracy?
Yeah.
The Warren Beatty movie that came out in the 90s. I love Dick Tracy.
Goodness, wow.
Based on the comic book, the old comic strip.
You're like Moses the Time Traveler.
Yeah. So I had on a Dick Tracy shirt. No, and a pair of shorts. No, I had the sheet completely over me. You couldn't see my Dick Tracy shirt and my shorts until it all fell off. And I was wearing a beard made out of cotton balls. Moses, and I had to read from an index card about Moses, and then I was Pontius Pilate, in an Easter play.
Wow.
So
you went from like best guy in the Bible to like
one of the worst. Yeah,
one of the worst.
And I was
never like being Haman.
Yeah, I was never in a nativity scene. And then, of course, the Lord called me into the Messianic movement. I was about 25. I thought I was beyond those silly things. And then I was cast as a narrator in one Purim play, which never happened. And at the first congregation I attended, I was in Macon, and I got cast as just the narrator. And so we were using a church at the time, and and the church had these speaker rooms. Like if you're looking at the stage, where the pastor would be and where our rabbi would be, when we would use the church before we got a building. If you're facing the stage, on the top corners of the wall, there were these like speakers. But they were in these rooms, so you'd have to go upstairs, you go backstage, go upstairs, and go into these rooms. And I was sitting in one with a microphone, and it was the coolest thing. I was like up there eating Chick-fil-A, and like my friend was up there with me, and I'm just like reading and the dang play never even happened. So that was the worst play that never happened.
Oh man!
Because again, that's what we mentioned earlier in this episode, is that Purim plays almost traditionally. It's like if you make it good, you've missed the mark.
Yeah.
And the other one I was in is when I was in Savannah, and I was King Xerxes. And again, the one thing that's in common with Purim spiels in the Messianic movement, and church plays, is that the common thread is it's bad actors. It's hard to find, as Rabbi Eric said, it's hard to find people that even want to do it.
Yeah.
So you got the bad actors, and then you got the bed sheets.
You've got like the
bad actor, because everybody. Go ahead.
I was going to say, you've got like the 8-year-olds who've been forced to be there.
Because what does everybody do to get these costumes? They just assume that everybody wore sheets. Sheets and sandals.
At least do the decent thing and tie some seat on your sheet.
And I was King Xerxes wearing... I actually think the Rebbitzin in Savannah actually made some costumes. It was still made out of bed sheets. Stuff made out of sheets. And I had this beard that kept, I think I ate half the beard. It kept getting in my mouth.
The cotton balls, or
and so that's the thing, and again, people forget their lines, and and my wife's like directing it. I think she directed one year, and she's like having to
poor Brooke.
You have to throw people their lines.
Brooke's like she's been a theater person, hasn't she?
Yeah.
So
and being a theater person, even she knows that Purim plays have to be bad.
Yeah.
I think it would be funny to make a Purim play where you purposefully have things go wrong during it, just to make it seem
stage
like
we have done.
It's a production gone wrong.
We have done in the past Star Wars Purim.
Right.
We've done Flintstones Purim.
Oh, that must have been interesting.
We've done. We did recently a Purim where it was done through text message and
about COVID-19.
Yeah, Purim and COVID-19 all done through text message and Zoom.
Yeah, so like masks played a role.
Right.
It was cool. It was funny.
We did one a few years back. One of my favorite things to do was to get a script for a Purim spill and cast people for the different roles, but not give them the script till just before they do the spill.
That's a good idea.
And they actually have to have the script with them and interact with it. And so it's kind of got this improv note to it. And so they'll kind of scan the script and improv their part as they're going through. But so the first year that we did this, one of the guys who's unfortunately not part of the congregation anymore, but one of the guys that was in it was cast as Haman. And
maybe that says something about why he's no longer in the congregation.
We give everybody the opportunity to kind of figure out how their character is going to present themselves and what have you. And so he showed up, and it was a complete happenstance thing. But he showed up as a Purim costume. Couldn't get the word out, as a Purim costume that looked like it was like a Cholo costume. And so he
what
played.
Is that?
It's like a. South California, Southern California, LA area, like your it's kind of the, I'm trying to figure out the best way to word this, but it's kind of the typical like Hispanic gang member assumed look. That's not necessarily what it
okay, I got you.
People that dress this way aren't necessarily putting that off, but that's kind of the assumed. If you look on television shows and all, that's kind of the perception. But he ends up playing Haman as a Cholo Haman and like did accents and everything, and I mean it was one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life.
Well, it's funny. I'm looking at a picture right now. I was showing Toby because I was kind of curious too. I was like, I feel like I know what this looks like, but it's actually a little bit different than I was thinking. But last year, our Haman actually dressed in like a, what was it, like 80s like sweatsuit, 80s.
Yeah, it was the 80s sweatsuit with the big hanging necklace,
big
and
bling, big sunglass necklace. I mean, he was like a total.
Right, we did a Mad Lib Purim one time where we had like a Mad Lib where you fill in the adjectives and verbs and different things,
those things were hours of fun.
Right, and then rewrote the whole story using the fill in the blanks from.
That would actually be really fun to do with crowd involvement during the spill.
Right, that's what we did.
No, and I don't mean like writing it, but like you're get to that spot and pause and wait for somebody to scream it out, and then do
right. That's what we did. We had it on where they had the choice of 4 words they could choose, and then
give them no choice. Let it go completely wild.
No, I'm not as brave as you. I'm not giving my congregation.
You can set boundaries at the beginning, like there are certain words that are not allowed to be used.
It doesn't know. Whatever, but in my experience, you can get a bunch of monks in a cave doing Mad Libs, and it's going to go to a dark place real quick.
You should do a Mad Libs Purim spill with only the youth group allowed to give the suggestions.
No way.
That would be rough. The reality is that the Purim spiels, these little plays, they're given and done so, especially so the young people will have the experience. That when you do something like that, it helps you to remember. You use more senses, you use more sensory involvement, and it helps you to remember the story. The story of Purim itself, it's kind of like the story of Noah. Mm-hmm. You could make an excellent movie about Noah and the ark and everything that happens without adding any additional information, without Hollywooding it up.
Yeah,
now, they haven't ever done that, to my knowledge. Hollywood messes it up every time they try to do it. But Purim, all by itself, is such a powerful story of God's deliverance, of His provision, of His answering prayer, of all the things that go on for such a time as this and all that. But So the story itself should be read, and we read it in synagogue, just the story from Esther. But then you do the Purim play, so it adds these additional sensory connections to it.
And I talked a little bit about that on Shabbat. I was like, what kind of customs are you adopting in your life? What are they doing? Because customs and traditions they serve as memory banks for your walk with God, your walk with your family. Passover Seder. You have an exciting Passover Seder as a young kid. It's a lot of fun. Your parents get you involved. You remember that. That's a memory bank. Boom, locked in.
Little trip to everyone's memory banks.
Yeah, Purim spiels are kind of the same. Same thing. It's a custom that simply gets you involved in outside of just reading the Bible. And it's kind of like, I like to think of it like this. Like, if you ever read Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare, and then you go on and watch read other books, watch other movies, you'll be like, oh, this is a Romeo and Juliet story. Same thing happens with the biblical narrative. You know the biblical narrative well enough as a child. You grow older and you see a story that's kind of, it's supposed to be similar or a little bit different, twisted, kind of like the Purim spiels. It's supposed to be a little different. You're like, oh, this is a biblical story, just told in a slightly different manner.
Our Purim play for this year, we had designed, we were going to have huge chess pieces and a chessboard, and the characters from the Purim play were going to play out a chess match between the good and the good and the evil, between the Ahasuerus and Mordecai and the different characters from Esther and Vashti and all the bishops and the rooks and the pawns and all the people involved in it. Vashti.
Yeah. When I hear that name, I always think of, again, this Purim spiel where at one of our congregations, and one of the people in the play was like this. I think he was like one of the king's attendants, so he was announcing Vashti to come in.
Yeah.
But this guy, we're in Georgia. So it's Vashti.
Vashti.
That's exactly what it was. He goes, all right, look, Vashti. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so bad. It's great. But no, I was going to turn to David because I know you probably want to make a point, but I just, the point I was making too is that the story, when we do a Purim spiel, we're toning down exactly the reality of the really intense things that are in that story. Yeah. Especially with the king and Esther.
They tried to kill us. And we won. Let's eat.
And there really is, and here's the thing with the Purim spill, why it's such a valuable reality. And as Rabbi Eric was saying, when we celebrate Purim, one of the traditions is to read the Megillah, to read the scroll, the story of Esther from start to finish, which is it's 10 chapters. It's not very long. One of those chapters is 10 verses or something, and the last chapter is excruciatingly short. But nonetheless, it's a really intriguing story. It's really interesting. It's got a lot of movement in it and such. So we read the Megillah, and then there's the Purim spill that makes it kind of more alive in front of you. There's a lot of food and eating. You eat hamantashen, little Haman's hats, these little cookies that are eaten, and or Haman's ear, depending on whose interpretation or translation you're using. Now one of the funny traditions, not necessarily something that we prescribe to, but one of the funny traditions is within, especially Hasidic Judaism, Purim is a drinking holiday, very heavily drinking holiday. And one of the reasons, and because it's supposed to be celebratory and so on, so there's a lot of schnapps and vodka and stuff that's drinking. But one of the thing that's really interesting is that the tradition is that you're supposed to drink so much on Purim that you can no longer differentiate between Mordecai's name and Haman's name. Wow. So that you're, in essence, it's kind of like wiping Haman's name out, is the perspective behind it. Now, I don't prescribe to that. That's a lot of liver damage and whatever else. I did find it funny though that when I was in New York, I worked at an Enterprise Rent-A-Car in Muncie, New York, which is a substantially Hasidic area, and the only time that our clientele paid for Enterprise's insurance package was when they were renting for Purim, just on the off chance that something goes wrong. Now, what's really I think important though about the Purim spill and reading the Megillah and all this is Purim, much like Pesach is or Passover, we are supposed to celebrate this. The book of Esther, chapter 9, specifically says it's supposed to be celebrated and commemorated Ledor V'Dor, from generation to generation in continuity. And so one of the reasons that this is supposed to happen and that we do some of the things we do with Purim, just like with Pesach, is so that when our children ask us, what is this all about? We get to explain to them of God's miraculous provision of freedom and deliverance in the midst of such a terrible time in the history of the Jewish people. And when you look at and I think this is probably for me one of the most intriguing parts of the narrative of Esther and the observance of Purim, is when you read the book of Esther, a lot of people don't realize it's the only book of the Bible that never once mentions the name of God anywhere in the story. Now you see the hand of God in providence and such throughout the entirety of the text, but it's never directly mentioned. And so we see this really dark period of time for Jewish history, yet in the midst of this dark period of time, we see God orchestrating all these little pieces in the background that, had even one small piece not played out the way it did, everything would have collapsed around us. And so when we do these funny little Purim spills, like we're celebrating with joy and excitement of the miracle that God provided for us, but we're also making sure that we never forget the reality of how rapidly things could turn back to that again. And I mean, the reality is, and I hate to throw us into even remotely a political sphere in conversation, but the reality is that Achashverosh, or not Achashverosh, but Haman and his descendancy, his people are still alive today in the Iranians, and particularly in what we have seen with the Ayatollah and everything going on, the Iranian hatred of the Jewish people. And by Iranian, I'm talking the Persians, and specifically Iran is a Muslim country, but anybody that's from Iran that is not Muslim would call themselves Persians. But it's really important to understand that these battles that we see are still there, whether it's Isaac and Ishmael and the Jewish people and the Arab people, or it's Iran or the Persians and the Jewish people. These problems are still there, and so it's important for us to have these reminders, these commemorations of these events, so that we never forget what God's brought us through, what God can still do for us. And so, as Rabbi Eric was saying, these Purim spills, they're intentionally humorous and supposed to be fun. Like, it shouldn't be some big, like, heart-wrenching drama going on stage. It's supposed to make you laugh. It's supposed to, you're supposed to have fun. You've got groggers that you're using to make all this noise to blot out the name of Haman in the story.
Cheering and booing.
Yeah, it's supposed to be fun.
You're cheering for Mordecai, you're booing Haman.
Exactly, so that you're kept into the narrative and what's happening.
Right, and it's one of these things, when we celebrate Pesach, and we'll do that in a few months, the scripture tells us that we're supposed to celebrate and observe Pesach as if we were the ones that actually left Egypt. We're supposed to put ourselves into the story. And that's why we do the Purim spiels. That's why we read the Megillah the way we do, is it inserts us into the story. Because the truth is, as Rabbi David just said, anti-Semitism, the same evil that brought about the story of Esther and Haman and Mordecai, still exists today. And we need to understand that we are not beyond that yet. And that we need to look at our circumstances, situation in such a way that we put ourselves in the story, because we really are still in that story. We really are still dealing with the same anti-Semitic, the same hatred against God's people, against the people of the book, and dealing with that. So when we teach it to our children, we want to do it in a way that they see the victory of God and the joy of serving God, even in the midst of the things that were happening. So it doesn't become, downtrodden and negative and depressing, but that we win. We get to see how God over and over through the stories in the Bible and through the stories throughout history wins, even though the adversary tries to destroy us.
Yeah. And tying this back into Tu Bishevat, which is one of the conversations Rabbi Eric started with, is the observance of Tu Bishevat and the New Year of the herds, and the New Year of the kings, or the coronation of the kings, etc. All these things are also a big part of that. Yes, they are traditional observances. They're not necessarily biblically commanded or ordained. They're traditional observances, but the whole point of them is to draw our attention constantly back to the provision and supplying of sustenance from the hand of God. Shabbat, traditionally you have 2 loaves of challah, and the reason you have 2 loaves of challah that you're saying the blessing over is not because you necessarily have enough people in your household to eat 2 loaves of challah, but because of the reality that there on Friday morning there were 2 portions or a double portion of manhu, of manna, that was able to be gathered in preparation for Shabbat, where there'd be no manhu provided. And so there's this reminder of the double portion in the celebration of Shabbat. And so everything is to draw our attention back to the idea of God's provision, whether it's provision for nourishment and sustenance, or it's provision for deliverance and freedom. And as Messianic believers, it's all the more important. Like, what blows my mind is the fact that the greater body of Messiah as a whole has just kind of thrown all of this away. Like, Esther is just one of those Sunday school stories from the Old Testament perspective.
VeggieTales movie.
Yeah. There's no real interaction with it, right? Yeah. But the reality is, as Messianic believers, what greater thing is there for us to rejoice in and commemorate than God's deliverance and redemption and restoration and provision of safety and so on. And we see this idea of salvation wrapped into the narrative of Esther, the undercurrent there all the way through the story.
And the reality is, as believers, part of our faith is that at some time in the future, there's going to be another deliverance that God brings about, a victory of his people in a time when there's tribulation, when there's problems, when the whole world turns against Israel, when all these things happen. And these stories that we read in the Bible, like Passover, like Esther, that show God's deliverance are the precursors. It's the feeding of our souls that prepare us for having faith for what's coming up, that we see that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and that he delivered us in the past, so he'll deliver us in the future. And so when we have our children involved in these stories, like the Esther story, the story of Haman and his sons and his wife, and all that comes up in the edict to kill all the Jewish people, is a dark story.
Yeah.
And yet, when we read it and when we go through it in synagogue on Purim, it is not lighthearted, but it is done in a way that gives life, that doesn't look only at the negative. But when we say Haman, we boo. When we say Mordecai, we cheer.
Yeah.
Because God is still in the story.
Yeah. Makes it palatable. It's not a...
Right, so when our children see it and are involved in it, they're not like, oh, woe is me, I'm a Jew, or woe is me, I follow the Bible. Everything's, let me go eat worms. But it's really, God has a victory for me that I can hold on to. And so these Purim spiels, although they are whimsical, although they're done in a way where, it's so funny to listen to the kids who will say, man, that was such a good play. That was so fun. And the parents are like, oh, that was like going to the dentist. It was, to go through and endure.
Yeah.
It still is a way for our children to connect with the reality of a loving God who provides mercy and grace and love for us. And we do it in ways that are entertaining and exciting, because we want our children to understand that we have an exciting God who does, we talk about superheroes. There's no superhero greater than our God.
Yeah.
And all the man thought of superheroes are just imitations, cheap imitations of the true God and our Messiah.
Well, and I'll say that, a lot of times with the kids especially, and even with the adults, last year, the play, the adults were rolling most of the time. Mm-hmm. And, there's a level of joy there that should be, we're supposed to be kind of whimsical and kind of, funny. Life is fun, especially our lives. Life in Messiah is fun. Right. There's a happiness and a joy there that can't be bought with what the world offers. And so, that's why I don't understand when, because I've met folks who are like, well, we can't do funny plays. It's, it has to be serious all the time. I'm like, bro, Like, here, let me show you a more excellent way.
But I always tell people like that, there are times for us to be very serious. Yeah. I mean, our faith is a serious faith, but it's also a faith of joy and peace. Yeah. And when people say, we have to be really serious because God is really serious, I just point them at the platypus. Mm-hmm. Because there's nothing that is not funny
or serious
about you look at a platypus, it's like almost like there were spare parts left and God just put them all together to form it's like I need one more animal, so I'll just put all these pieces together. Now he didn't, and we know that God purposely designed the platypus perfectly in its way,
and there's a reason for it. We may not know what it is,
we may not understand it, but
it's the hulk of animals.
Right, but it is, when you think about it, it's just funny.
Yeah.
And God created us with humor, and humor is used in the scripture. Just think about Paul. Paul gets up on Mars Hill and says, I think you guys might be a little too superstitious. Now, that's just funny.
Yeah.
I mean, he points directly to these Romans who have all this pantheon of gods.
Yeah.
And he just makes a statement. I think you guys are a little overboard on this superstitious
because,
stuff.
like, in Roman annals, like, Judaism and the Jews were, in the Romans' eyes, some of the most superstitious people on the earth. Because it was like, in the Romans' eyes, it was like, you actually believe that the things you do in life actually, like, your God actually, like, cares about those things. Because, in the Roman and Roman theology and Greek theology, gods could care less about what you're doing, or, right or wrong or indifferent, whatever. Now, if you might be serving them specifically, then they might care. But
Roman theology actually put us as pawns and pieces in the greater game of the gods, rather than God actually being involved in our life and wanting us to be blessed and to provide and meet our needs. It was more a matter of people meeting the God's needs than God meeting our needs. So, anyhow, Purim is an exciting time. If you've never been to a Purim program or a Purim spiel at a synagogue, we encourage you to find a Messianic synagogue near you and join for their Purim celebration. Make sure you try the Chamantashen. Make sure you celebrate the full feast. Do not, as Rabbi David said, get so drunk that you can't tell the difference between Mordechai and Haman, because the Bible does say not to be drunk.
And if for whatever reason you do, stay away from your car, because if you can't remember Mordecai from Haman, you won't remember right pedal from left pedal either. So,
just stay away from drunkenness, but go and enjoy the program, the play, see how it's done, participate. And it's really important that we understand that these celebrations are done so that the Word of God will become real to us. And these plays and programs are done so that our children will learn in different modalities and formats, so that it will become part of who they are, so that they'll be able to teach it to their children and their children's children.
And I think it gives them perspective, and this would be my last thing, it gives them perspective that not everything they put on in life has to be perfect. It doesn't have to be the perfect Texas church Christmas play, that happens out west every year, the big, I forget where it is, but it's massive, it's perfect, they've got all the production. It lets them know that whatever you have, do your best with and enjoy it.
I tell people when they come visit our congregation that we are the most perfect group of imperfect people they'll find. And really that's God's people. And Purim plays are supposed to show that when we look at it, not everybody in the Purim play, first of all, everybody involved in the story of Esther should not have been in Babylon, in Persia. They should have all gone back to Israel already. Israel has already been restored as a nation. They're out of Israel, not doing what they should have done, and the result of that plays out in the story. So we have imperfect people being used by a perfect God to establish God's perfection, His love, His grace for that people, and the end result is such a messianic thing that not only are the Jewish people redeemed, not only are they saved, But it then says that many of the non-Jewish people become followers of the God of Israel, become praisers of the God of Israel. And so this is our story. We're supposed to live our life in such a way, with such joy, with such love, with such peace, that those who do not know the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will desire to follow him because of our life and because of what God does in our life. So anyhow, I hope this helped you to understand a little more about Purim. I do encourage you, if you don't know where to go, check out the umjc.org website, the IAMCS website, to find out different congregations in your area you could go to and enjoy Purim. Plant a tree in Israel or in your town and enjoy and celebrate Tu Bishevat and Purim where you are. Shalom.
Thank you for listening to the MessianTics podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.